But postbiotics are byproducts of the gut bacteria. So it's sort of like what happens after you give the probiotic, the prebiotic, you get the postbiotic.
You're listening to the Ethos Athletes Podcast, where we believe that your health is the number one resource you need to accomplish your dreams. My name is Dr. Matthew Hernandez, and I'm a physician dedicated to helping my patients maintain their active lifestyle and continue doing what they love. I'm sitting down with other experts so that we can provide our listeners with the knowledge they need to improve their health and live their best life. Hey everyone, this is Dr. Matthew Hernandez, and you're listening to the Ethos Athletes Podcast. And today we're going to be continuing our performance optimization series, where we give you tips and tricks and the things that you need to look at biochemically to get your body to perform its absolute best. For this particular series, we brought in Dr. Warren Brown, who specializes in this. Dr. Brown, welcome to the show.
Great to be back, Dr. Matt. Thanks for having me. And also wanted to congratulate you on that article in the Phoenix Business Journal about your practice. So it's great to see you guys are doing so well over there.
Oh yeah, thank you so much. I appreciate that. Yeah, we got recognized as being one of the top practices here in Scottsdale. So that was a nice honor that we were able to share.
Awesome.
And nice to see all the hard work put in and rewarded us with that. So that was great.
Well deserved.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. So for those of you who listened to the last podcast, and if you didn't, you should definitely go and check it out with Dr. Brown, where we kind of go over the overview of everything when it comes to performance optimization. For those of you who don't know Dr. Warren has a private practice here in Scottsdale. It's called Clinical Advances for Sport, where he's been helping athletes and active individuals reach their highest levels of health and performance through his advanced clinical approach. And when I ran into Dr. Brown, we were introduced by a mutual friend. I was really impressed with the approach that he takes to help people increase their performance from a biochemical standpoint and from a body function standpoint that's outside of the structure of just being strong, being fit, stuff like that. This goes deeper into a number of different things that we talked about, and we kind of gave an overview of the last one. And so, just a quick recap of that: the 6 aspects of the clinical advances for sport are gut function, energy production, hormone balance, detoxification, immune response, and structural integrity. So again, if you want to understand those a little bit more big picture, go check out the last episode with Dr. Brown. And then today we're actually going to go and dive into the very first aspect of his system, which is gut function. Our overview for it was basically talking about digestive efficiency and gut function. And can you give us a little bit of reasons why we should pay attention to gut function and how that relates to performance optimization?
Yeah, definitely. And, the statistics on the gut are mind-blowing, really. It's 70% roughly of our immune system is in the gut. About 80% of our neurotransmitters are synthesized in the gut. If we were to slice open the digestive tract lengthwise and stretch it out, it would be an area that could cover a tennis court. It's that much surface area that we're talking about. And that helps us absorb nutrients from food and a number of different important factors involved in that. The bacteria in the gut have about 100 times more genetic information than what's in the entire human genome. And the DNA from these bacteria are what's called the microbiome. And that's what's, there's been just a lot of information coming out about the microbiome over the last 20 years or so. And part of that is thanks to increased technologies that allow us to look at that and research it. So, but the gut those bacteria in the gut do a number of different things for us. They make vitamins like B vitamins, vitamin K. They make enzymes like beta-glucuronidase, which plays a role in recirculating hormones. There are certain parts of the gut where there's so much activity from the bacteria in the gut that it's often hard to kind of draw the line between what's going on in the gut and what's actually part of our own body, because technically everything in the gut is just passing through. So just really amazing what it does. And last time we were talking about that it's so much more than just breaking down food and creating energy from it, which in and of itself is pretty remarkable. But it's so much more than just extracting calories from food. So it's just a fascinating area. I love talking about gut function.
That definitely comes across. It's interesting the amount of research that has really been done over since I started medical school, basically, where there's more and more research. I think I get like a update from Medscape every day talking about the new research in gut function and how that can impact so many different aspects of our health. And so, yeah, we'll dive into some of those today. Now, one of the things that we briefly touched on in the last episode was intestinal hyperpermeability, also known as leaky gut. Let's dive into that a little bit further. And for those people who missed the last episode, I guess let's start off with what is leaky gut or intestinal hyperpermeability?
Yeah, leaky gut is basically just this situation where the cells that make up the wall of the gut have started to develop cracks between them, essentially, where proteins that are not supposed to cross the gut barrier and enter the bloodstream are actually doing so. Often when it does that, it creates this immune response where we start having food sensitivities or we start having autoimmune reactions, things like that. So it's basically just cracks that are developing in the small intestine and allowing stuff to cross the small intestine that's not supposed to.
Okay, perfect. And then what are some of the causes for this particular syndrome?
For athletes, it really tends to be, there's a few things really. Motility is one. So problems with motility, meaning how slowly or how quickly things move through the digestive tract. When we become constipated, we're more prone to develop permeability. Ischemia seems to be one, mostly for the endurance athletes, where they're spending so much time shunting blood flow away from the gut towards their muscles that it's almost like starving out the nutrients and oxygen and things that keep the gut healthy. So ischemia seems to be some form of ischemia seems to be an issue. And in stress, which you mentioned last time, which is often overlooked. I mean, if we're in a fight or flight response, or if we're constantly pumping out stress hormones, that'll limit our ability to make digestive secretions and break down our food. Mm-hmm. So that can be an issue for athletes as well. I also think poor diets contribute to that. So
absolutely,
a lot of times athletes are getting advice on diet from a teammate or a coach or a sketchy website. So poor diet choices, processed foods or convenience foods, those are often not very good for gut health. Alcohol intake for some folks, those kinds of things, and that really does set us up for improper immune responses to foods and ultimately permeability.
And we also talked about, or we touched on NSAIDs being an issue with intestinal hyperpermeability as well, correct?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I forgot about that one. Yeah, aspirin, ibuprofen. A lot of times athletes are taking that like a multivitamin every day.
Buying the Costco size and going to town with it for sure.
Yeah, it's terrible. So that stuff really does cause it's tough on the kidneys, it's tough on the intestinal lining. It's basically it shouldn't be taken on a regular basis.
Yeah, absolutely. Are there any other medications you're aware of that can cause this issue?
Generally, they're like anti-inflammatories. Those are probably the ones that I think about first, but there's probably others.
Yeah, I wasn't sure. I want to say like the proton pump inhibitors for like heartburn, stuff like that. I want to say that causes them too, but I could be wrong. But they definitely cause a lot of other problems if it doesn't cause just that. So,
it's a good point, because if we're suppressing stomach acid, then we're not completely digesting our food.
Right.
If we have more undigested food in the small intestine, that can lead to problems. And yeah, I could see that one being one as well. It's a good point.
So again, going back, intestinal hyperpermeability is basically where we get these gaps in our gut cells, essentially, where proteins that aren't supposed to pass through that barrier end up passing through. It can be caused by a number of different things, from NSAIDs to diet to ischemia, etc. What are some of the symptoms that people are experiencing leaky gut or from intestinal hyperpermeability?
Probably some of the most common are autoimmune conditions, if it's really bad and prolonged for a long period of time. So Hashimoto's, which is just extremely common. Leaky gut's been linked to rheumatoid arthritis as well. Fatigue is a common one that somebody might feel. They might feel that they're not, that they're having inappropriate reactions to food. So fatigue, headaches, skin issues. It is. There's just a long list of things that patients could experience if they have a permeable gut.
Yeah, no, absolutely. For most of the listeners that know that I specialize in treating joint pain, and if you're a new listener, then I guess you know that now. And essentially, one of the things that I look at when it comes to the joint pain aspect is if people are having pain in multiple joints. This is intestinal hyperpermeability is one of the things that I look for right away, because I've been able to see where if we start treating that, I've had individuals who their joint pain just goes away, and then they don't need the other therapies that I do, which is primarily injections and stuff. And so we can definitely improve their joint pain just with that alone, which I'm sure, Dr. Warren, you've seen as well in your practice.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point. It is the root cause for some of the other conditions that drive people to go to see their doctor. So, it's great, and it's not that hard to treat, and it's also pretty easy to detect. There's some good tests that can help to assess that, but often clinicians will treat it presumptively. But there's patterns you can see in IgG food antibody testing that would suggest permeability. There's the lactulose mannitol test. There's zonulin testing. So there's a lot of different ways it can be tested for, but it's it can be treated pretty easily and pretty efficiently.
Let's go into what that looks like. I guess before we jump into the treatment, you talked about how some athletes get it where they're either like pounding NSAIDs, or the endurance athletes that are constantly shunting a bunch of blood away from their GI system for their muscles. Are there any other ways that athletes can get it?
Can get permeability?
Yeah.
I mean, aside from NSAIDs and stress and ischemia and motility and poor food choices, I think a lack of nutrients in the diet, which I think would fit into that same category of poor food choices. But there are things like amino acids that we have to have for gut health, like glutamine, for instance. That's the preferred fuel for the cells that line the wall of the small intestine. And if we're short on that, which athletes often are, that could set us up. And that's one of the reasons why it makes a good treatment for leaky gut.
Yeah, that makes complete sense. So we talked about some of the symptoms that people experience. Let's say that one of the listeners is like, "Oh crap, I have Hashimoto's, or I have this." What are the tests that you mentioned? A few of the tests. Can you explain maybe the pros and cons for each one, and what they're looking for specifically?
Sure. Yeah. The pros and cons. So for the lactulose mannitol test, pretty easy test to do. It does require drinking a lactulose mannitol solution. Usually comes in the test kit, and then the person collects urine for 6 hours. And lactulose is a large molecule. Mannitol is a small molecule. So by measuring the amounts of those that show up in the urine, you can kind of tell, was the large molecule getting through? Ordinarily it shouldn't. So you can kind of tell from that test is if there's a hyperpermeable gut. IgG food antibody testing is often used to look for food sensitivities, and if you're seeing a lot of reactions show up, patients reacting to pretty much everything that they're eating, that could be a sign that maybe there's a hyperpermeable gut, and more of those food antigens are crossing the gut barrier inappropriately, and you're seeing that immune response in the blood. That's a blood test, not the gold standard for testing permeability. That would probably be the lactulose mannitol test for that, at least in terms of what's in the medical literature. But that I always wonder about that if I'm seeing a lot of IgG reactions show up in my patient. that maybe they have a permeable gut. Zonulin is one that's that comes up a lot in the discussion about leaky gut. But most of the test kits, at least as far as I know, everybody that's measuring zonulin in the United States is using a kit that is looking at zonulin family peptide, not necessarily zonulin itself. Okay. So it's interpreted a little differently. So there's some gray area there with zonulin as far as I'm concerned.
Okay. So maybe not the best one. I'm assuming the one you use is the lactulose mannitol test.
Yeah, that's the best one. But often if everything in the patient's clinical history is pointing towards permeability, then I will. Sometimes I'll treat it presumptively,
right?
Because the treatments are usually things that are nutritive to the gut anyway. So it's often, it's not a diagnosis that we have to nail down hard and fast all the time.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And that's kind of been my experience too, is usually if the symptoms are presenting like it's intestinal hyperpermeability, then I'll usually just treat that. Some people do want the data. And so I'll do like a food sensitivity test. But yeah, I mean, and then if they want to go a step further, then I'll do the lactulose mannitol test. Most of the time you can just go, I mean, at the end of the day, the treatments are, as you said, they're restorative to the gut. They're not going to do any harm by any means. And so you often be successful when you have the clinical decision or when you know what to look for as far as, treating that aspect.
Exactly.
We talked about how to test it. So I guess what do we do about it at the end of the day, right? Like we've talked about treatments being easy. We talked about stuff like that. What is that people can do about their issue if they do have this?
We always think about the cause first. So if it's NSAIDs, what's going on? Why are we having to take so many NSAIDs? So correcting that. And so I always think that's issue number one. Dealing with motility, dealing with if they're an endurance athlete, then there are some things that we could do like L-glutamine that can be really effective for that. Stress management can be part of the treatment plan. But as far as nutrients and supplements, I generally think about glutamine, aloe gel, or slippery elm. Mm-hmm. Some clinicians use DGL for that, which is a licorice extract. Probiotics, Saccharomyces boulardii, these will help modulate that immune response in the gut barrier, and that often helps as a treatment. Making sure they're getting enough fiber, making sure they're making good food choices. And even things like polyphenols and phytonutrients like curcumin, for instance. Those kinds of things tend to be, for the most part, the core of my leaky gut protocols.
Awesome. Now, you mentioned glutamine, and I know we probably have a number of listeners who are familiar with glutamine, but for those who aren't, it's an amino acid. Let's talk a little bit more about it, because the listeners that probably have heard of glutamine, but they've also heard of like branched chain amino acids too, which is the common amino acid complex that a lot of athletes go and take. So let's talk about the differences between these two and why each one is important.
Yeah, branched chain amino acids are leucine, isoleucine, and valine. Those are really important for building muscle. They're some of the amino acids that get incorporated into muscle cells. So they do help with athletic performance in that sense, especially if somebody's low in amino acids. The branched chains can be really helpful. So they're usually thought of in that context of putting on muscle. They are essential, so we have to get those through the diet. Mm-hmm. Glutamine is non-essential, so it can be synthesized by the body, but it is really important. A lot of sports medicine-oriented research on glutamine has found that the theory is that it's used as a fuel for some of the cells in the immune system, and that it has immunostimulatory effects, and that might be the mechanism for why it's important for athletes who, during prolonged exercise, have suppressed immune function. But I also have that suspicion that because leaky gut is so common, that and glutamine being the preferred fuel for the enterocytes in the gut, I also have that suspicion that maybe it's helpful on that front as well. There have been some studies that looked at plasma glutamine levels and after prolonged exhaustive exercise and found that basically that athletes are low after exercising glutamine.
Okay.
And I think the rationale there is that if they're doing intense endurance races, things like that, they're bound to have some immunosuppression, and that might sort of deplete their glutamine levels during that. They might burn through their glutamine, in other words. One study mentioned that looked at endurance athletes, and they were given glutamine after competition, and they observed them for a while, and they found that they were having fewer respiratory infections. Yeah. The groups that were supplemented with glutamine were having fewer respiratory infections than those that weren't. So it's really a neat little amino acid, and it's important for gut health, important for athletes. And it can be used therapeutically for a number of different conditions.
When we're looking at amino acids and sources of amino acids, there's some sources that are said to have like their complete, they have all the essential amino acids versus others that don't have all of them. Are you able to speak to what some of those sources might be that do give you a complete profile of essential amino acids?
Yeah, typically those are animal proteins. Mm-hmm. So animal proteins, animal products will have all of the essential amino acids. It is possible to get all of the essential amino acids from a vegetarian or vegan diet, but it does require some food combining, meaning that if you're by combining things like beans and rice or corn and rice, you can get certain amino acids in one of those foods, and then you get the rest of the amino acids in the other food. So it is possible to get complete protein from vegan or vegetarian diets. The only potential problem with that is that basically there's two. So one is that you generally get a lot more carbohydrate with those foods. Mm-hmm. So that's something to look out for. And the second issue is sometimes those patients can be a little low in things like B12 and iron, which are more plentiful in animal proteins. I'm not against vegan or vegetarian diets at all, especially if they're done correctly. I think they can be a good option for some folks.
And that's good to know. One of the other things I wanted to talk about for sources, I don't know if you've seen this, but I've actually seen, obviously in none of the products that we use, and I, definitely not in any of the products that you use either. But I've seen some patients who come in and, they say, oh yeah, like I'm taking this glutamine supplement. I heard it's good for you. Found it online or found it in this store, whatever it is. And so I purchased it and I've been taking it. And then you go and kind of look at the type of glutamine that they have in the product, like in the ingredients list or whatever. And, it's like 50% L-glutamine, the other 50% is D-glutamine. Have you seen stuff like that before?
Oh, yeah, you're right. And the products that you and I are using, they're coming from a professional line supplement company. They're in the active forms. They're in the right forms. It's not the cheap stuff, but it's therapeutic. So that is definitely something that we see this a lot with magnesium. I'm sure you've seen this a lot as well, where patients taking magnesium oxide. And they're like, I don't understand why my muscles are still stiff. I'm taking magnesium. And you look and it's the oxide form, which is like only about 10% of that is absorbed compared to something like magglycine or magmalate or other forms of magnesium are generally absorbed a little better. So yeah, you're right. I mean, supplement quality is a huge issue.
Yeah, absolutely. For those of you who aren't familiar with the forms of amino acids, there's essentially an L and a D form. And you could think of it as like your right and left hand, where it's like a mirror image of the other. Your body only absorbs the L form. It doesn't absorb D. And so if you have a supplement that, is 50 or 50-50 each one, you're only really absorbing the L. So 50% of the product that you're ingesting is a complete waste. And you wasted your money on that, unfortunately.
That's a good point.
Understanding that is important when you're purchasing supplements. And so that's where, so stuff like myself and Dr. Warren, we're able to go and figure out what forms are the best for a given situation, stuff like that, and go from there.
Yeah. Excellent point.
We talked about glutamine. We talked about branched chain amino acids. In your protocol for leaky gut, you also mentioned some probiotics as well. So let's talk about what do you look for in a probiotic, essentially, since we're going into what we look for in supplements.
Yeah, generally, in a probiotic, we want, as a general rule of thumb, you really want ones that have a blend of lactobacillus and bifidobacterium. Those are the ones that just have the most data on them in terms of being important to gut health. So I like to see multiple strains of each in my probiotic. If a patient has a particular condition like inflammatory bowel disease or something, and we're trying to manage that as well, then I'll try to pick one that has been researched for that purpose as well. So there are certain strains of lactobacillus that you might pick. You might want to see in greater amounts in a probiotic where you're treating a specific condition. You could also think about Saccharomyces boulardii, which is a probiotic yeast. So that one has a number of different benefits to it, including modulating the immune response right at the gut barrier, the intestinal lining. So Saccharomyces boulardii is great for that. And it's actually a yeast. It's not a bacteria, but it is still a probiotic in a sense. And then there's fermented foods, which I'm always trying to get patients to eat more of, because this is how the gut typically gets them, is through fermented foods. And those would be things like yogurt and kefir and kimchi, kombucha, sauerkraut, things like that. But you're getting live bacteria, and getting it through food, you just get this constant supply of it if it's part of your diet. And seems like most of the research that I've seen is that these probiotics don't colonize the gut.
Right.
They actually need to be taken on a regular basis because they're always passing through. They're tourists. They're not residents there.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point to make as well, as to keep up on it. I do know a lot of the studies that have been done on fermented foods and stuff usually come from Asian cultures, and they ingest a lot of fermented food in their diet, and so a lot of the GI symptoms that they experience are different from what we experience here in the Western part of the world. Different things like that, and their GI problems are slightly different, but they don't have as many as the Western world, essentially.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Okay, so we talked about the probiotics. Like I said earlier, there's been a lot of research that's been developing on the gut microbiome over the last few years, and this is where, I think I get literally a Medscape notification, once a day or a few times a week at least, talking about, there's whatever new research paper was published on gut microbiome, or how the gut is, correlated to immune system or whatever it may be. Is there anything, and I'm sure you get these as well, so is there anything that's new that's caught your attention in this research?
Yeah, I think the concept of, there's two things really: postbiotics and polyphenols.
Okay.
And postbiotics, a lot of us are familiar with probiotics, which are the actual bacteria themselves. Some of us are familiar with prebiotics, which is the things like fiber, resistant starches, beta-glucan, inulin. Those are things that feed the probiotics or the gut bacteria. But postbiotics are byproducts of the gut bacteria. So it's sort of like what happens after you give the probiotic the prebiotic, you get the postbiotic. And that's kind of a newer concept. And these would be things, postbiotics would be things like butyrate, which is a short chain fatty acid that is important for the health of the colon. So we talked about glutamine is kind of the fuel for the small intestine. Butyrate kind of is like that, but for the large intestine. So it's really has a lot of beneficial effects. The colon needs it to stay healthy. And it could be classified as a postbiotic. So I think we're going to learn more about that one and other postbiotics going forward. The polyphenols, these really have this really unique relationship with gut bacteria where polyphenols can it's a two-way relationship. They can influence the gut bacteria. The microbiota can influence polyphenols or produce polyphenols. So it seems to be like there's a lot of unanswered questions there about that. But generally, polyphenols are what we get through colorful fruits and vegetables. And we tell people to eat those all the time. So this is maybe not new, but it seems to be newer in terms of the mechanisms we're learning about that. So I think those two areas we're going to see some more exciting stuff come out. But is it going to change the fact that we're telling people to eat a diet rich in colorful fruits and vegetables? Probably not. We're probably still going to tell people to do that, but we'll learn more about why that's important and the interactions between those nutrients and the gut bacteria.
Those are super interesting topics. The postbiotic is interesting because I guess. Like going and learning what the byproducts of the bacteria are and how that impacts our health. That seems really interesting because most people just think of the byproduct as waste, right? And in reality, it's like one of the things I learned in all the years of biochemistry that I took. It's like there's very few products that are actually wasted. Almost everything that's a byproduct goes to do a chain reaction somewhere else.
Mm-hmm.
And so. Seeing what the byproducts of those bacteria do and how it impacts our health is going to be interesting.
Definitely. And I think it's going to be a topic that we're continuing to hear more about. And gosh, we could go on and on about gut health.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, one of the things that I know has been a question in the last few weeks. Maybe a few months now. I can't even remember when it came out, but I'm sure you've seen the Netflix or have heard of the Netflix documentary Game Changers and how basically they talk about, what's the best diet for an athlete. And then, there was follow-up to that documentary where we talked about, they debunked everything that was said in Game Changers. And so then, now we're kind of left as, okay, well, what's true, what's not at the end of the day. So given that you're an expert in this particular topic, is there any particular diet that you recommend for athletes? What does that look like in general for you?
Yeah, it's a good question. And really it's a personalized diet is going to be the best approach. So I'm not against keto diet. I'm not against paleo or Mediterranean or things like that. I think there is a right diet for the right athlete. And the three key areas that I think about when I'm trying to come up with, what is this patient's right diet is what kind of sports activity are they doing? Because if they're a bodybuilder, or a soccer player or an ultra marathoner, they're going to have different needs. So what kind of activity are they doing? Do they have any allergies or sensitivities? Because that will also dictate what they eat. And so therefore it's part of the diet. And then what are their genetics saying? Do they have SNPs that might make some foods more important than others? In other words, do they have genomic mutations where they make an enzyme that's not functioning the right way, and so they're going to need higher levels of a particular nutrient to support that enzyme? So those are kind of the things that I think about before telling somebody what they should be eating. Generally, if I'm at a party and somebody asks me, it's I generally give the advice of Michael Pollan. Eat food, real food that is, not too much, and mostly plants. And that's kind of, I think you really can't go wrong with that strategy, but of course we can customize that and really come up with something that's personalized. And that's where the research is headed as well, is personalized nutrition being more important.
Yeah, and I love the approach of how you broke it down. I think it's very simplified and very easy for people to understand. Of what's your activity, what are your allergies and sensitivities, what's your genetics. Say, are you able to give an example for each of these? That way, people can kind of understand a little bit more of like, let's say you have a bodybuilder that has a sensitivity to, I don't know, gluten, and I don't know, you can throw in whatever genetic SNP you want to use as an example.
Yeah, bodybuilder who's sensitive to, let's say, gluten or
heaven forbid dairy, because then that takes way out of their arsenal.
Yeah. I mean, that's a good example too, because a lot of times bodybuilders will develop sensitivities to dairy because they become more dependent on that.
Right.
It's a source of protein, and often they have, if they're trying to build muscle for a competition, then they're going to need more protein than the average person. So they might be more of a paleo type of diet, but if they have a dairy sensitivity or allergy, then dairy is going to be out. Or if they have an egg allergy, which I've seen quite a bit of, then eggs are going to be out. And so they might do a sort of a modified paleo where they're eliminating dairy and eggs. So that's definitely, one example. And if let's say they also had a genetic SNP for COMT or MTHFR, then they might have greater needs for B vitamins. And so we might focus more on, for the vegetables, we might focus more on dark leafy greens to try and get higher levels of B vitamins through food. And we also might think about a B complex, but that's kind of an example. And then there we just in those 3 steps, we've personalized the diet for that particular athlete with that particular goal. So it's really there's no easy answer for what's the best diet, but I think it's a personalized diet is going to be the best approach.
No, and I love that messaging. So I mean, personalized diet, improve your personal performance, right? Because at the end of the day, we're looking at performance optimization, and your performance optimization is going to be completely different from someone, from another person. How do you personalize both of those things to you? How do you prevent leaky gut and overall, and just improve your gut function overall? Because ultimately, that's that's how you're going to improve your performance.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'll write a book about it. The personalized diet. It's going to be the new thing.
Yeah, that's perfect. I love it. I'm looking forward to reading that. Awesome. Well, yeah, I think we covered all the topics we needed to on gut function. Unless there's anything else you'd like to add.
I think that's enough for now. If there's a great response to this, maybe we'll do another one about one of these topics in particular. I'd be open to that. But yeah, I could talk about gut function all day and often do. So, but thanks for bearing with me and talking it through with me. It's always a pleasure to come on the podcast, and I look forward to the next one.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And speaking of the next one, we are going to be talking about the second part of Dr. Warren's system of improving performance or performance optimization, and that's going to be energy production. So again, if you want to learn a little bit more about what the big picture of that looks like, check out the last episode. And then otherwise, we hope you enjoyed this episode, and thanks for listening.